Hello, everyone. Welcome to the AIA Contract Documents webinar on the Progressive Design Build Delivery Method. Just a quick disclaimer to get us started that none of the content we go over today should be acted upon as legal advice. If you have any kind of issue that requires legal attention, we encourage you to just reach out to a local attorney. Another quick disclaimer that the presentation is protected by copyright laws, and that just pertains to reproduction, distribution, and display, because again, you will be receiving these slides. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to our presenters for the day, who are going to take you through the presentation. So I'll pass it over to Donovan, Michael, and James to introduce themselves and take you through the real content.
Thanks, Sydney. So I'll go first. My name is James Germano. I'm an attorney, manager and counsel with the AIA Contract Documents program. I am a construction attorney. I went to law school in DC and then worked for a construction law firm for a couple years before coming over to the AIA. And I've been with the AIA for about 2.5 years now, working in the Contract Documents program, which means I largely work with the Contract Documents Committee, updating and generating new documents to provide to the AEC industry. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike Bamba to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yes, my name is Mike Bamba. I've been with the AIA Contract Documents program since, I guess, 2006, so almost 15 years now. I am an attorney. I went to law school in DC as well. And prior to joining the Contract Documents program, I worked for a firm in the DC area that represented architects and engineers. I have been involved on a number of different agreements that the AIA has written, but for this presentation, I was one of the attorneys on staff who headed up the Documents Committee member task group that worked on the design build documents. So I will be going over those documents towards the end of the program. Donovan, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Donovan Olive. I'm Assistant General Counsel with HOK. I've been with HOK for about 14 years now, since 2007. I am an architect and an attorney. Started out as an architect and then went to law school and became an attorney. And I'm also a member of the Contract Documents Committee, have been since 2016, and have had the pleasure of working with Michael and James on that committee.
Awesome, thanks, Donovan. So let's get a little bit into just an overview of where we're gonna go today. So the learning objectives for today are, first, we're gonna learn about current trends in design build, and specifically progressive design build. And Donovan is gonna touch on that, and then also the second learning objective, which is learning about the unique risks specifically as it pertains to design professionals. And then he's gonna hand the mic over to me, and I'm gonna talk about how traditional defenses may not necessarily work, or they might be a little bit different in the progressive design build framework. And then lastly, Mike Bamba is gonna close this out by talking about how the AIA contracts, and specifically the AIA's design build contracts, allocate the unique design build risks associated with that delivery model. Before we get into the substance of current trends in design build, I want to spend just a couple of minutes going over the history of the AIA Contract Documents program, because I think it's important to have a framework and a general understanding of the way that the contracts are developed, because it'll help inform today's discussion. So the AIA Contract Documents program has been around. The first document was published in 1888. It was actually an owner-contractor agreement, and it's the one that you see on your screen right now, believe it or not. And that is sort of what has morphed today into becoming the A201 General Conditions document. So if you're familiar with the AIA Contract Document, usually you are familiar through the A201. You've heard of it and probably have used it on a project. And that's the document that created or has morphed into that, that general conditions document. You may have heard that the AIA contract documents are generally referred to as the industry standard, and that's because they've been around for so long that the industry, and specifically project participants and courts, have interpreted and become accustomed to the language and the framework, the risk management techniques that are embedded within the AIA contract documents, such that the industry has sort of adopted the AIA's framework for how to allocate risk in the industry. And there's risk management and risk shifting principles that are embedded into all of the documents. And that brings us to the iterative drafting process. So you might know that the AIA contract documents, each document is updated on a revolving 10-year cycle. So for example, the design build documents that we're going to reference a little today, they're updated usually in the years that end in a number 4. So 2014, and then they'll be updated again in 2024, 2034, etc. Well, throughout those 10 years, there is a drafting process and an updating process going on. And what happens in the background before we get to 2024 is this last bullet point. We are performing market research. We're going out to industry stakeholders. We're reaching out to AIA members and receiving member resources. We're reaching out to liaisons that are not architects, so contractors, owners, developers, insurance professionals, attorneys, anyone who might have a stake in how the risk is apportioned in our documents, subject matter experts, etc. And then the AIA Contract Documents program, a couple of years before the publication date, will sit down and take all of that information, all the research, the comments, the liaison information, the critiques, etc., and sit down and update that document. And that we go back and forth with the committee to outside liaisons to the internal content team attorneys we have here at AIA Contract Documents program. And over the course of a couple of years, we'll update those documents such that they're ready to go on the right year. So a lot of work, a lot of sweat equity goes into that process, such that when you pull the 2014 or in a couple of years, the 2024 design build documents off the shelf, so to speak, a lot has gone into that, and you can be comfortable that that document, even unedited, apportions risk fairly and balances risk appropriately. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Donovan, who's going to talk about current trends in design build and specifically progressive design build. So Donovan, why don't you take it away?
So I want to just offer a quick introduction into some of the legal and project delivery trends that we're seeing at HOK with design build projects. In the last 6 years, just to kind of put things in perspective, HOK has seen design build grow from roughly 3 to 5% of our revenue to well over 50 to 60% of our revenue is through design build projects. These are the largest projects in our portfolio. They're often with construction budgets that are measured in, the billion or multi-billion-dollar range. These projects range from everything from airports to rail transportation, hospitals, detention facilities, higher education. And so clearly for HOK, design build is the project delivery method of the future. Now, there may be many reasons, certainly single point of contract responsibility and the perception that there's schedule and cost certainty have driven owners to select design build as a process, but really the emergence of P3 has been the single biggest driver towards design build delivery. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, P3 is public-private partnerships. These are very complex design, build, finance, operate transactions that allow for the private development of public property or public facilities. The trend is really toward more of this in the future, with governments not likely to raise revenue through traditional means. It's likely that you'll see public infrastructure being developed through private use of private funds and private developers. Because these are extremely complex contracts, they create complexities and challenges for the design builder, which of course consequently flow down to the design team. one of the complexities is that the owner is often a multi-headed collection of stakeholders with differing and often conflicting interests. So you'll have the developer operator, which is the private entity that holds the risk primarily. The developer will enter into a lease agreement with the public owner for the development of the property. The developer also has contractual commitments with financiers who often impose their own covenants regarding the fitness, suitability, or insurability of the final work. That also gets flowed down in through the design build contract to the design team. And then of course you have the lessor who is the public entity. This public entity will lease the public land to the private developer for a specific term. Once that term is completed, then the property will revert back to the public owner. One of the challenges with public entities as the ultimate owner is they often serve as the authority having jurisdiction, and we'll talk about how that can play into and have a significant impact on how projects are delivered. So of course the question isn't really whether to engage in design build, but really how are we going to do that, and we hope to answer some of those questions for you today. There are many approaches to design build, and I'm not going to get into every single variation of it. Almost for each project, there's a different approach. But I do think that risk can be categorized really based on how the design build team is selected. And there's really two approaches to that. You have value-based selection or a qualification-based selection, which actually serves as the basis for progressive design build. So here are some of the key features that distinguish value-based design build from progressive design build. In value-based design build, the design and construction team is selected based on cost. It's a cost-driven procurement. There is some baseline criteria that is prepared by others working with the owner, but not with the design team or the construction team. Prior to when a cost proposal is set, the design team is required to advance the design. Usually it's through an SD, maybe DD or bridging documents level of completion, but the point is that it's an incomplete design. It's not complete. Nonetheless, this design will set the basis for the fixed commitments that the design builder makes regarding the GMP and schedule. And the GMP and schedule covers everything, including the further development of design and construction of the project. In a progressive design build, the design team and construction team are selected based on qualifications. There may be some methodologies that are compared. There may be some pricing as far as the fee percentage that the design builder will charge, but they're really more of a qualification-based selection and not cost-driven. The owner will typically issue a baseline set of design criteria that includes a program target, contract price, and target contract schedule. And then very much like IPD, you'll see that the design team will go through a process that will, one, validate that the program cost and schedule are achievable. Program is achievable within the cost and the schedule. And then based on a mutual commitment, the owner, design team and construction team will jointly progress the project to a particular point based on the validated targets. And then once you get to an agreed point, which is usually much further down the line than in a value-based selection process, then the GMP and schedule are set. So these are two entirely different selection processes that have play out in completely different ways, which we'll illustrate as we go through. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what are two two major risks, and you can categorize the risk into, we're going to talk about it in two buckets. One is what we're going to call the design development risk, and then the other bucket will be the construction delivery risk. So I want to start out borrowing a little bit from a very knowledgeable person and person that we at HOK interact with quite a bit, David Hayden with Donovan Hayden Law Firm in Boston. David's an advisor to architects and engineers across the nation, from everything from contracts, claims to risk management. And he's really seen design build evolve over the years and has started to sound some alarms about the risks that the design build imposes. And one of those risks is this design development risk, which he defines as the time and cost increases above what the design builder has set in its fixed commitments. David refers to this as the A minus B equals C claim, or the A minus B equals C risk, where A is the actual cost of the work minus B, the design builder's proposed cost for the work, equals C, the value of the claim against the design team. And the basis for this claim is really attributable to the design development process. And just to talk about that for a little bit, I know everyone on this call is familiar with that process. You know, you take the owner's design criteria and you advanced it into a set of requirements for construction of the work. But really, there's a lot that goes into the design development process. It's an iterative process. It involves the influence of studies, investigations, analysis, development of design, review by the owner, input, revision, coordination. It involves constructability reviews, design collaboration, value engineering, design assist at times, submittal preparation. It's a process that goes from owner to designer to contractor, back to owner, designer, contractor. And when that process is shortened, or one of those key players is not involved in that process, then there's a huge opportunity for scope gaps and for a misunderstanding of the requirements. So the risks arise primarily from two factors. In a value-based design process, that's usually from incomplete definition of the requirements for construction and a lack of understanding of what the stakeholders really want. And really, it's important to understand that the longer the runway between when the fixed price is set and when design is complete is the greater the opportunity for scope gaps or a misunderstanding. It increases proportionally, some may say exponentially, with the amount of design that's to be completed after those commitments are set. And these scope gaps or these misunderstandings then get characterized as errors and omissions in the design team's preliminary design, which by its very name is incomplete. And so, you know, really how you have omissions in an incomplete design is difficult to get your head around, but nonetheless, is definitely the greatest risk. It's in that preliminary design where the risk arises. And so, in my view, this is really where the rubber hits the road on how value-based design build is distinguished from progressive design build. In value-based design build, the design team is contracted to prepare a proposal, not to prepare the design, but to prepare documents for a proposal for setting a price. The scope of this engagement is very limited. It's usually contracted on a teaming agreement, but the terms are very limited. The design team is required to advance the design using the owner's design criteria, which ultimately it cannot rely on. And then there may not be enough time, or the design builder just may not be willing to pay for studies or investigations that are needed to validate that criteria or otherwise establish reliable bidding documents. And it's also typically void of engagement with the stakeholders, or if there is stakeholder engagement, it's very, very limited. And so that there's a really not a real high degree of understanding of what their interests are when you're preparing that preliminary design. Contractual protections are incredibly important in a value-based design process in that teaming agreement. And oftentimes we don't pay attention to what the teaming agreement says, or you know, we as architects and engineers have not really made use of qualifications or clarifications to the extent that trade subcontractors have. And I tell our team at HOK, we need to start thinking like trade subcontractors. We need to issue qualifications, and the design build agreements are really really important terms that must be negotiated and really survive completion or termination of that teaming agreement. What typically happens is that those the design agreement will supersede, but it's important to make sure that the qualifications, such as, you know, that what we are preparing is a limited design. It will serve as a basis of the design, but further design is required. A design contingency is required. You know, there's a lot of qualifications that should go into that. So just to reflect on what progressive design build, how it's different, is that the design team is then, you know, selected to, first of all, validate the program cost and schedule targets that the owner has established. Now, if these targets cannot be validated, there's an off-ramp for owners. They do not need to go forward with the project, or they can redesign, adjust the program to meet the schedule and cost. The owners, designers, and design build team collectively work together through the design development process to advance the design. So you do get stakeholder input into the design, and you also get constructability review by the design builder. Fixed commitments then on GMP and schedule are set later once the requirements of construction are sufficiently developed to allow that. And as I said before, it operates very similar to IPD in this aspect, in that there is an agreement on program cost and schedule targets. So, you know, one thing that we'll hear a lot is, you know, well, a design contingency should just be established to cover the cost of refinement. And I agree. I think design contingencies are absolutely important. And the longer the runway, again, between design or between the setting of the commitments and the completion of design, the greater the contingency needs to be. And the design contingency needs to cover both time and cost increase due to the natural refinement or progression of the design after the GMP and schedule are set. It's appropriate in both value-based design and progressive design build, although the contingencies might be of different values. And you know, you'll get pushback from design builders saying, well, design contingencies are not intended to cover errors and omissions in the designer's work. Well, that's true, but what they are intended to cover are that natural progression, that natural completion of design that must occur. And so it's important to have in your teaming agreement or in your qualifications design contingency requirements. And then one final risk we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation is that this owner's implied the owner's implied warranty of adequacy or suitability of the final design does not exist in design build. In fact, it's been replaced with a complete lack of reliance on anything that the owner provides at all, and really shifts all of the risk and responsibility for validating the owner's requirements to the designers and design build team. So the construction delivery risks, these are different than the design development risk. I would say design development risk is is unique and much greater with value-based design build. What you'll see here are risks that are probably exist to some degree on every type of design build project, whether it's value-based design build or progressive design build. However, our experience is that on value-based design build projects, these can be very amplified, some of them much more than others. And one of the risks that you'll see is that after the requirements are set, after construction starts, there'll be changes to the design because of procurement impacts or other cost-saving measures to try to stick to those GMP and schedule commitments. And some changes that we've seen in the past, which are not they're quite substantial changes and have a material impact, maybe a complete change to the curtain wall system from precast to a rain screen. While that may seem like an important change to make to meet a schedule, it still requires a considerable amount of coordination with structural and with the architectural to make sure that type of a change will work across the entire facade of the building. We also see the shifting of design responsibilities from the design team to the build team. So primarily in MEP and structural efficiencies, there'll be an attempt to gain efficiencies by shifting design responsibilities to either the structural engineer or to the mechanical, or even vice versa. And these changes also create complexities in coordination and the issuance of design information to the field. Another big source of issues, and this is really true with P3 projects in particular, are changes to the constructed work by the owner stakeholder. And there, on P3, it seems that many of the stakeholders have a high degree of influence after the GMP is set. And the design builders are very reluctant to push back on some of the changes that will occur. These may occur from the stakeholder just realizing for the first time what they're buying, what the space actually looks like. It may occur from public comments that are received and they're reacting to that. These changes might occur as additional revenues are released from contingencies, and they want to get reinvested back into the project. Also, you might have on some large projects like airports where you have then tenant fit out changes. So as you're designing the core and shell of the terminal building, the developer is then retaining their tenants that will fit out some of the retail space and will come back with changes. On some large, on a large aviation project, HOK recently did, we had, as we were approaching completion of design, over 130 additional changes to the work just brought through, by the stakeholders, the various stakeholders in the process. So these they can impact what you're doing and the timeliness of how you're doing it. Also, one thing that is probably true on every project, but what we're seeing a lot on design build is the increase in the number of bid packages. So where you might have 5 bid packages at the beginning of the project that are grouped together, excavation, site prep, superstructure, core and shell fit out. Now you're seeing these packages broken into smaller and smaller constituent parts that require, faster issuance of design information to the field. And then as these parts are broken down, they may be expanded across, where you're issuing these constituent parts by level of a project, or you're issuing them by phase of a project. As you issue more and more bid packages, this leads to a huge burden on coordination on the backside when you're trying to get to a conformed set. And in design build in particular, these coordination issues get characterized as errors and omissions. There is no benefit whatsoever to the design team of breaking a project down into more and more bid packs. These are always for the benefit of the owner or the design builder, yet we seem to want to please our client, and we do it, and often to our detriment in doing so. Another big issue, and this is when I spoke about earlier, where you have the public body or the lessor as the authority having jurisdiction, is in code interpretation. You can guarantee that code will be interpreted in a manner that gives the greatest value to the public body when they receive that building in the end. And so these may result in some material changes to the project as it goes through the design review process. There might be changes to the smoke control system that lead to a better system. Changes in the designation of exit corridors, which have a huge impact. The further down the road this occurs, as you have to go back and refit mechanical to now pass through an exit corridor. Strict interpretation of flood zone designations. You just cannot rely on ordinary and customary variances to be available on some of these projects, and so it's a real challenge in getting regulatory approval. But then probably the most significant risk, and this is true on any type of projects, but really true on design build, are delay damages. In addition to flowing down liquidated damages, which are never in lieu of other damages, they're always in addition to other damages. Then you have to deal with the other delay costs, such as loss of productivity, acceleration costs, extended general requirements. And what we're seeing is that delay costs will take, they'll multiply by 2 or 3 times the amount of a claim of a impact of an error and omission. So where you might have an error and omission that's a reasonable amount to address, you're facing 2 to 3 times costs above that as far as delay costs. Unique to design build contracts are the concept of back charges, maybe not withholding, but back charges definitely. And back charges and withholding are a little bit different. Back charges are a system by which the design builder will serve as the judge, jury, and executioner on whether or not you had an error and omission and what that impact was to either the design builder or another project participant. And so an amount is withheld from payment and redirected to the harmed party. These are not covered by professional liability. There's no airing of was the standard of care breached. They are often treated as a strict liability loss or a commercial loss as far as professional liability carriers are concerned. Withholding is a little bit different. Withholding is where the design builder, or on traditional projects, the client may just withhold the fee, claiming that they've incurred losses due to the architect or engineer's performance. That just puts the architect and engineer in a position where they're left to try to recover that fee at the end, and oftentimes it gets just waived as an offset to these alleged errors and omissions. And again, in both those situations, whether it's a waiver of fee or the fee is just grabbed and taken away, neither of these are necessarily covered by professional liability insurance, because there's not been a process where a breach of the standard of care has been established. And then other challenges: limited or no opportunity for equitable relief. And you'll see in these contracts, unless there's entitlement, unless entitlement is granted by the owner, it will not be granted by the design builder, although there may be many instances in which the design builder may direct work that impacts and has nothing to do with what the owner's requirement to pay. And then, as we mentioned earlier, a GMP really has an impact on a betterment or value-added claim. And so what we're saying there is that the design team, it doesn't really have the opportunity to claim betterment or value added to the design builder. That's a claim the design builder must run up the ladder to the developer or to the design builder's client. And a GMP is an opportunity for the client just to say, no, I contracted for a complete system, a complete smoke control system. I contracted for a complete curtain wall system. This is a cost that you'll have to eat. And so it's difficult for those value-added claim, for the design builder to assert those value-added claims under a GMP or fixed price scenario. What designers then find themselves in the position of, instead of claiming value added on omissions, we're usually in a defensive position of claiming failure to mitigate. So if the design builder is unwilling to take the value added claim up the ladder, then that would be your position as a designer, is that you failed to mitigate your damages by collecting it from a party who is ultimately responsible for it. And so that's a huge change in how you look at omissions and the defense of design team liability. Other issues, and again, not unique to value-based design, but definitely inherent in design build contracts, are really flow down of onerous contractual requirements, broad duties to defend, and then unlimited liability. Although I will say that at HOK, we've been successful in getting limitations of liability and waiver of consequential damages, or both. And when we're most successful in doing that is when we've worked with the designer, the design builder, to get those limitations in the design build contract. Then it's more likely that you'll be able to get it in the design contract. And so with that, I'll turn it over to James and Michael.
Thanks, Donovan. We actually have a question that came in while you were presenting, and I think rather than wait till the end, if it's okay with you, I'd rather just kind of ask you now and get your thoughts on it.
Sure.
So somebody asked if you can maybe give an idea of a design, maybe a typical design contingency amount, and you had talked about that briefly. Is it a percentage of construction costs? Is it some other method that's typically used? What do you usually see in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, and it really is a factor of, as I said before, how much of the design remains to be done, and it's usually quoted as a percentage of construction costs. Oftentimes it's been anywhere from 3 to 4%, but if you're establishing the GMP and schedule on really thin proposal documents, it could be as high as 7 to 8%, maybe higher. So it's really a factor. From HOK's perspective, we start out on our typical progressive design, or depending on where we are on the value-based design, but really no less than 4%.
Awesome. And then when you had said that HOK has had some success, especially of late, with limitations of liability in these kinds of contracts and other types of contractual protections along those lines. How is a limitation liability usually structured in your experience?
Well, we do look for a clear limitation of liability that is limited to a specific amount. Now, oftentimes the insurance requirements will play into that conversation. So, whatever the insurance that is required from the developer or from the design builder is usually a good place to start. We don't like to have insurance, or we don't like to have limitations of liability that say available insurance, or that don't state a specific amount. So usually we try to have it, a number stated. But if the if the developer and design builder are requiring, say 10 million per claimant in the aggregate, that's usually a good place to start, and it may go up or down a little bit from there, depending on how negotiations play out. Another factor that played heavily, especially on some very large projects, is whether or not there's a project-specific policy. And in those instances, it's really important for us to have our liability limited at that policy, and to hold it there. What we're seeing, and as a result of some of the things that we've talked about today, and David Hayden has talked about in the past, is this crisis of professional liability on design build projects. You might see project-specific policy being just way too expensive to procure on some of these large design build projects, because of the design builders view that the professional liability policy it really takes the place of the contingency on the project. But that's I hope that answered your question, maybe a little bit more. But
sure, yeah, absolutely. The limitation liability sort of potential ways to structure it that you discussed, is that typically, would you see that in the teaming agreement, or would that be in another contract and maybe flowed down to the architect from there? I guess, where is it typically found?
Well, you really got to start out with that limitation liability stated in your qualifications. So on your very first proposal to the design builder, you need to state specifically and clearly, will require a limitation of liability in our design contract. Now, you may not have enough information to be able to state what that number is, but you need to set the expectations in the quals. And then when you get into the teaming agreement, you need to establish a limitation of liability. Now, that often limits your liability for the services performed under the teaming agreement. And so the design agreement then follows and will usually supersede the teaming agreement. It's really important to try to make sure that the terms of the teaming agreement survive the completion of the services required under it, but then also that limitation of liability needs to be stated in the design agreement specifically. And it will probably be, a different limitation liability, and then there'll be sort of an argument about, whether or not they're cumulative, or one supersedes the other, or what is that limitation of liability. So really at every touch point in your proposal process and contracting process with the design builder, that you need to have that conversation and need to have it documented that that's your intent.
Definitely. Donovan, you are very popular with our attendees. You're getting a flood of questions coming in. Some of the questions that have come in, we're definitely going to answer within the next couple of minutes. So we do need to move on, but there's one, if maybe I could ask you one more before moving on.
Sure.
And that is there a standard understanding or definition of what constitutes a material change to the design by the designer, such that the owner can essentially veto?
A material change by the designer. Yeah, I don't know that well, first of all, the concept of material change is going to vary from state to state, and there's some states that will have case law that defines, what a material change or cardinal change is. So I would say, look to your local case law in your jurisdiction. as a source. But I would think that the material changes really, where things really sort of pop up, are whether or not an owner's comments have created a material change. So is the owner just pointing out that some design criteria was left out, it needs to be added, or is the owner actually pointing out or interpreting the design criteria to require something more than what was contracted for in the GMP? That's the friction line I see much more in these design build, and especially in the P3 scenario, where you might have comments and changes not necessarily coming from the design team, but more from the stakeholders in their review comments.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to part 3. Thanks, Donovan. That was really, really insightful. Part 3 I'm going to cover, and that is how some traditional defenses, primarily we're going to talk about defenses for design professionals, but not all of them. Some of them are going to apply equally to the design builder, contractor as well, and how they might not work if you have a progressive design build framework. So the first one, Donovan previewed it for sure, and everyone is probably familiar with it, is the United States versus Spearin, the Spearin doctrine. So I'm going to spend maybe 2 minutes going over what happened in this case. All of the attorneys who are listening in probably just rolled their eyes because they've heard this a couple hundred times, but in case it's new to you, Spearin is a case that originated out of the construction of the Brooklyn Navy Yard back in the 1910s. And there was a dispute over whether or not the drawings that it was a traditional design bid build, the drawings that were given from the owner, which in this case was the United States, to Spearin were sufficient and accurate, and whether or not they showed it was essentially a dam inside of a wastewater runoff tunnel that went underneath the project. And it was undisputed that the drawings that were given from the government to Spearin did not contain a description or a specification, a design, drawing that contained this dam. So Spearin did not know about it. So what happened? Spearin performed the project, and that dam caused trouble. There was a really bad rainstorm, I think a year or two later, and it backed up and flooded, and they had to redo the construction around that particular pipe. I ran the inflation calculation this morning, and I've read this case a bunch of times, obviously, and I've never really figured it out. And I think it was around a $2.5 million claim in today's dollars. So not huge, but big enough. So the owner, the US Navy, said, you were supposed to examine the site. You were supposed to make sure it was suitable for the work. You were going to check it against the site conditions, check the plans against the site conditions, and you were responsible for the entire project until I, as the owner, accept it as complete. Well, Spearin came back and said, well, wait a minute, the plans and specifications you gave me were defective. So the US Supreme Court got involved. This case made it all the way up and said that if the contractor is bound to build according to plans and specs prepared by the owner, the contractor will not be responsible for the consequences of defects in the plans and specs. This responsibility of the owner is not overcome by the usual clauses requiring builders to visit the site, check the plans, and to inform themselves of the requirements of the work. So thus, the owner's provision of plans and specifications import an implied warranty that they are accurate. So when the owner gives plans and specifications to a contractor, they are implying that they are accurate. It's an implied warranty. So what is Spearin generally, and why might not it work for progressive design build? So what is it? On the left-hand side, it's the owner's implied warranty. And then why might not it work for progressive design build? So on progressive design build, the design team is going to be involved throughout the entire design and construction process. So therefore, the implied warranty is going to be a less powerful argument, because if you have a design bid build, you have the design team involved early on, and a bid package to the owner that can then go out and they can use that to solicit bids. That process obviously is interrupted in design build, and even more so with progressive design build, such that there is no implied warranty because the design team is involved throughout the process. The next argument that might not work in a progressive design build scenario, and Donovan touched on this, is betterment. So betterment is defined in Bruner and O'Connor, which is a construction law treatise, on the left. And because the purpose of the contract damages, and if you can hear my 5-month-old not wanting to take a nap in the background, I apologize. But because the purpose of contract damages is to place a non-breaching party in the same position that it would have been had the contract not been breached, remediation enhancements that give the non-breaching party more than what was originally bargained for, or more than what was intended and otherwise would have been paid for if not inadvertently omitted from the original scope of work, must be credited and to the damages claimed. So essentially, it's in the tort world, it's a tort concept known as benefit. So the reason why it might not work in progressive design build is in progressive design build, an owner is going to give the design team and the design builder parameters and performance specifications. And then it's up to the design builder, the design build team, to design and construct the project to meet those parameters and specifications. So in that scenario, because you have what are essentially performance specifications being handed to a design build team and parameters, then the design builder can't come back and say, well, wait a minute, what we actually gave you was better than what we bid on. So therefore we can net that out from damages. And a very easy analogy to this, or an example, would be if you have a design bid build on a house, and the bid is $1 million, and you have construction grade appliances, for example, in the kitchen, right? So let's say one of those appliances, your stove, doesn't fit, but that's what was in the bid package. Well, if that has to be replaced with a much nicer stove, then that would have brought the price of the house up to, say, $1,500,000. We're assuming it's a very nice stove. Then that, even if it costs a little bit more than that to repair or replace it, that can be net out from the damages from the contractor, because the owner is receiving a much nicer end project than they would have. Well, in progressive design build, that's not the case, because the owner usually says something like, I want a kitchen with the following types of things. I want a stove that is 36 by 36 inches and can get up to 600 degrees. And it's up to the design builder to then just install a model that fits. And if the one that they choose doesn't fit, that's on them, because they have to bring in one that meets that specification or those parameters. So it's difficult to make the betterment argument in a progressive design build scenario, simply because of the way and the timing through which the project unfolds. The next argument that might not work is withholding payment, and this one's relatively straightforward. So the withholding payment defense, and this is usually for design professionals. The design professionals on a traditional project, they're paid that should be 2 words, for most of their services at the completion of design work. So their design work is done. They create bridging documents, like Donovan was saying, perhaps, and then those get sent out, and that's the vast majority of the design team's work. So that's what for what they're being paid. Whereas in progressive design build, that argument might not work, because the owner and the design builder might structure the architect's payment to occur more during the construction phase, and the architect is likely going to be involved more during the construction phase, which gives them meaning the owner and the contractor, the design builder, the ability to withhold payment more easily if they so choose, simply because of the timing during which the design team is involved in a progressive design build framework. And lastly, the standard of care. And Donovan touched on this a little bit. The traditional standard of care defense, and this is because we're talking about standard of care, we're necessarily talking about design work. Traditionally, architects are held to a standard of care which requires them to perform services, quote, consistent with the professional skill and care ordinarily provided by architects practicing in the same or similar locality under the same or similar circumstances. And that's a quote out of the B101 2017 document. Well, practically speaking, in a design build and specifically progressive design build model, the owner and the design build team might have less tolerance for architectural errors and omissions, since the architectural team is involved from the project from, essentially from start to finish. So, Donovan was saying this is sort of looked at for the attorneys in the audience, more like a strict liability type situation, practically speaking, when it comes to E&O, errors and omissions on behalf of the design team. So again, some of these are more legal concepts, like for example, Spearin and how that doesn't come into play. And some of these are just more practical and just pragmatically how they might work in the field. So just things to keep a lookout for when you're negotiating design build projects and then working your way through them traditionally or specifically progressive design build. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Mr. Mike Bamba to talk about how AIA contracts allocate risks in the design build and progressive design build frameworks. Mike?
Thanks, Jimmy. Yes, so we're going to be going over the AIA's offerings in the design build context. So, we won't be going into them in super depth. That's its own program, really. But what I'll try to do is give you an understanding of what we offer, and then taking some of the topics that we've discussed earlier, show how some of those risk mitigation factors, especially the design process, is set forth in our documents to hopefully mitigate some of the issues that can arise on a design build project. So we have two types of design build documents in our program, and the first one is, it's relatively simple. I have this is the rudimentary relationship diagram for one of our sets, and it's the A145. It's a standalone owner design builder agreement. The owner has the option of getting consultants if they want, and we have an agreement for that. But this is a straightforward owner design builder agreement. It was written with the focus of really like single and two-story smaller residential projects, not massive design build projects of the type that Donovan was mentioning earlier, or that are part of a P3 project. So this is a much simpler contractual structure, but it is similar to our more complex one in that it is more similar to a progressive design build process. But we're not going to really be talking about this one, but I just wanted to, in case you were thumbing around through our library of documents and you saw two types of owner design builder agreements, I at least wanted to point that out. So what we'll be focusing on today is our more of our core design build family, and that it all is based around the A141, which is our standard owner design builder agreement. And that is what defines the relationship between those two parties. Now, we have a whole host of other agreements as well that are part of that family, but for the most part, we're going to be focusing on the A141 because that's where this progressive design build process is established in that document. So, I think what's most important about our documents and how it allows you to adopt a progressive design build approach is that the A141 is not set up in a way where the contract sum, which is usually going to be a cost of the work GMP type of project, but the contract sum is not established when you execute the A141. It has the expectation is that there will be some level of a design process that occurs where you have some of the more traditional give and take back and forth between the owner and the design builder, obviously supplemented by the design team and hopefully the construction team as well, to refine the design. And then once the owner and the design builder have reached a comfort level with the design, and then the design builder and the owner will execute an amendment to the A141. And it's that amendment that sets the contract sum and the GMP. And it's that structure that allows the parties to be more protected. And really, you know, we've been focusing a lot on the design professionals' risks in you know, with that lack of design in the early setting of the contract sum and GMP, but really all the parties are set up to a certain amount of risk. The earlier you set the, you know, as Donovan liked to say, the longer the runway is between when the contract sum is set and when the design is complete, everybody is exposed to more risk. And most of the disputes arise during that period of time, and trying to work out who deals and who's responsible for the various changes that were necessary to achieve the owner's goals on the project, for their budget, for their schedule, and things like that. So, you know, I wanted to put up what our full family of documents were. We have the B143, which is what the design builder would use to hire its architect, and you know, the architect could hire its consultants, the rest of the design team, to C441. Similarly, if the design builder is not going to be doing the construction themselves, which usually they're not, they're gonna bring someone else on. There's an A142 to hire either a single GC, or you could have multiple A142s on a project to hire the trades all separately under a direct contract to the design builder. And then if there's subs underneath those contractors, then we have the A441. So, you know, that's the full suite of documents. But again, we're going to be mostly focusing on the A141. So for progressive design build, I think the major focus is that our documents, the A141, one of its main goals is to try to keep the notion of design in design build. I think that for many owners out there interested in design build, obviously the perception or the value is that you have a single source contract, single source of responsibility for design and construction. I think anybody who's had any experience in the construction industry knows that the bifurcated process is a challenge, to say the least, where you have separate design and then separate construction contracts where those two parties aren't related, and maybe you don't talk as much as they should. So the notion of having a single point of responsibility design builder is attractive to project owners and developers. And I think there's a notion that two things happen. The design is faster, and it's informed by the construction team, and I get to a price earlier. You know, I'll know what I'm in for, and because the design and the construction team are both involved, then that contract sum is less likely to change. I think that, however, that's a bit of more of a myth than an actuality, because if you move the contracting time for the price up too early in the process, you have removed the benefit time, which, as Donovan was pointing out, is to allow for validation of the owner's design criteria. It doesn't allow the and one of the points Donovan was making earlier was that lots of times you don't even while the design team isn't even given the opportunity to communicate with the ultimate stakeholders of the project. I mean, if you think of a hospital doing a design build project, the hospital administration, actually, they're not really strangers to the construction industry. They're one of the more frequent participants when it comes to building projects. But the contracting team you know, while they work in the building, they're not the ones who are ultimately using the building. So if you're setting the contract sum early on, or even when you sign the agreement based on basic owner's criteria that have, you know, just really been sifted through the administration team, and you know, you're not really getting a contract sum in a design criteria based on interaction with the ultimate stakeholders of the project, which are the people working in the hospital and using it for its primary purpose. You won't really get to that point until you're much later in the design process. But at that point, the contract sum and the GMP have already been set. So, you know, so you can see the potential problems that would arise. Now, keeping design and design build, though, doesn't mean you throw the full traditional, you know, design phases into the project. You're not going to have, you know, schematic DD, CDs, and construction administration in there as the traditional design phases that we all know. But so, and we actually, this was a challenge we had when we were writing these documents, was to, you know, allow the design build process to maintain, you know, truth to its advantages, which would be a quicker design process informed by the construction team as well to reach a contract sum and GMP earlier in the process, but also allow for enough back and forth between the owner and the design team to really get to a point where they can refine the design enough to make the contract sum and the GMP make sense and be based in reality. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is just go over the design process that we have set forth in the A141. And it really all begins with the owner's criteria. When
We have a question that came in,
Sure.
and perhaps you could answer it now, or if it's going to be part of your presentation later on, but I just wanted to make you aware that this question's out there if you wanted to work it in. And
Sure.
It's essentially, yeah, big picture. What's the difference between design build, specifically progressive design build, and CM at risk in terms of the delivery models?
I think the simplest distinction is that in CM at risk, while you have the CM is going to be potentially involved, well, they will be involved to a certain extent in the design process. Usually, even in CM at risk, the design team is on board first doing some initial work. The CM will come in, they will provide their input. But it ultimately has that bifurcation of the design and construction process, which is the major difference from design build, where the design builder, who is responsible for both design and construction, ultimately is responsible for construction. So, you know, once you get to, so I would say that CM at risk is preferable if in terms of collaboration and to the traditional design bid build process, and it will have its benefits over design build as well, I'm sure. But the major difference is that it's not all happening. It's not that single source of responsibility that owners are often attracted to. You still have ultimately that bifurcated process where one side of the contracting chain does the design work, another side of the contracting chain does the construction work. And so, you know, really ultimately, once the CM is done providing its input during the design process, which can be limited or it can be more extensive. The more extensive it is, the more you're taking advantage of the CM process. But once that is done and the contract sum is set, it really breaks off into a traditional project where the architect and the design team are doing CA work, and then the contractor is responsible for construction. So you kind of you start to lose the opportunity at that point for the ideals of design build, which is collaboration between the design team and the construction team. Now, whether or not that really happens on a design build project once you get there, you know, I don't know. Hopefully it does, but I'd say that would be the major distinction in my mind between the design build process and the CM as a at-risk process.
Awesome,
So,
thank you.
In the A141, it all starts out with a description of the owner's criteria. which is, typically that's going to be a fairly general statement of the owner's goals and program, but that's where the owner is going to set forth, what it wants the project to be. It's possible that the owner could provide a fairly detailed set of bridging documents if it had hired a design team in advance to prepare those bridging sets. But whatever the scope of this information, those become the owner's criteria. So on the spectrum, it can be very basic, or it could be a fairly detailed set of bridging documents. And the notion of how developed that owner's criteria is will impact the design process, but that doesn't really change the design process. So the first thing that the the design team is going to do in the owner design builder agreement is they're going to, so the owner's criteria are established in the agreement. That is something that is filled in our documents. Then the process really kicks in. And so the first step is the design builder with its design team, hopefully some of the construction team. They're going to meet with the owner, review, and discuss those criteria. And then based on that meeting, they will follow up with a preliminary evaluation of the owner's criteria. That is where they really are beginning to start the validation process, because it's a somewhat basic description of the project, and now the design team and the design builder and the construction team hopefully are involved at this point as well, are beginning to bring their expertise to bear on the project. And so, once you've had the preliminary evaluation, they'll move on to a formal written report. That is the deliverable that would come out of this process. Now, these early steps, that's, like I said, where you begin to validate the design. This is an opportunity to offer alternative design approaches, or maybe alternative construction recommendations. Again, with the end goal of getting to what the owner's criteria were going to be. And then, this is when cost and scheduling issues can start and procurement can start to be factored into the design, as well as constructability. So you really are this is where the dual benefit of having the design team and a construction team on the project from the outset really can kind of show its value to the project. And so we go to the next slide now. So once you've done, the next step is a preliminary design. One thing, and we don't need to go back in slides, but one of the things I did want to mention about owner's criteria, there was an earlier question about, when is there a material change to the design? And one of the things, when we started writing these documents, one of the criticisms of design build from an owner's perspective was, I give up control of my project when I sign a design builder up, because they've agreed to do it for a contract sum, and they're going to dictate all the changes necessary to achieve that contract sum. Similar, those were the kind of a paraphrasing a number of different complaints. So one of the things that our documents try to do is preserve the owner's criteria, initial owner's criteria, so that the owner's original goals and requirements can't be deviated from unless the owner affirmatively agrees to do so. So this design process is intended to flesh out the design, but consistent with the owner's criteria. So this is not directly in response to the question about when is there a material change, but the process in our documents make it so that there can't be a material change, quote unquote, without the owner's agreement. And it's an affirmative agreement. It can't be tacit, like, you were in that meeting, we told you about this, and we made this change. It has to be a written agreement. And you'll see that play out through this design process. So now we're in the preliminary design. So you've done the report, the design builder and the design team has made their recommendations about, changes that may be or different approaches, things like that, gotten more detail on the owner's criteria. The owner has to review it, and once they give consent to proceed, then the design builder does a preliminary design. And that preliminary design, you can read all the things that it includes, but this is when you're starting to put meat on the bones of the design. And the more you can put in here, the better you'll be in the long term, because you'll have a contract sum that's based on more decisions, more actual determinations made by the not only the designer, the builder, but also the project stakeholders. And then once you, and again, the preliminary design will be submitted to the owner. The owner will have an opportunity to evaluate it. As part of that preliminary design, the design builder is required to say if there are any deviations from the owner's criteria. So it's a very open and transparent, it's supposed to be in a very open and transparent process throughout this design. Once you've submitted the preliminary design and you get approval of that preliminary design and consent from the owner to proceed, that's when you start to you're getting closer now to the contract sum, to setting that GMP. Because now you've gone through at least it's not a full, design bid build design process, but it is a design process with the back and forth between the owner's group and the design builder's team. So now you're getting into the design builder preparing your proposal for the owner to consider. They're going to propose a contract sum. They're going to list all of the design documents and any other information that contract sum is based on. The better developed those design documents are and the more detailed that information is, the better the contract sum is going to be. And you'll have a better idea of what type of contingencies you would need to include in that contract sum to allow for the further development of the design. If you're trying to set this contract sum at the outset of the contract before you've done much design, or if you're just doing it based on a bridging set that another design team developed, the accuracy in that contract sum, that everyone's taking on risk there. The design build team, obviously the design team, and the owner, because we could be getting into a dispute, increasing the contract sum. None of those things are good for the project. Donovan was mentioning, you need to have clarity on that design teams need to make better use of what assumptions and clarifications the design includes, and then there's a place to include all of that stuff in the design builder's proposal, and it's an expectation that the stuff will be communicated to the owner, so they're fully aware of what the proposal is based on. And then going back to that material change question, there again, identify any deviations from the owner's criteria. So this will be where the rubber meets the road on modifying the owner's criteria. Up to this point, there hasn't been really like any kind of an amendment to the agreement, because again, the owner's criteria are set forth in the agreement. Nothing's changed those terms. The agreement hasn't been amended. But if it's agreed to in the proposal, what's eventually going to happen is that the parties are going to execute the design build amendment. And that is an amendment to the A141. So if there are deviations from the owner's criteria in the proposal and the owner is okay with those and executes the design build amendment, the owner's criteria have now been amended. So there's been a change in the owner's original criteria, original expectations for the project, but they were hopefully developed jointly. The owner understands why those changes were made and have agreed to them. And so the design team, the construction team, can now move forward with a new understanding of what the owner's criteria are going to be. And the new owner's criteria are tied to the contract sum and the substantial completion date. So they're all interrelated, but it's through that design process, somewhat abbreviated, but definitely an iterative design process, that you can reach a better contract sum. Because once that contract sum is set, as Jimmy and Donovan were explaining, the incentives for the owner is really saying, I bought a project that's going to do these things, and you said you were going to do them, design builder. Well, the design builder has that obligation up to the owner. And so downstream to the design team, they're not going to get the, it's not as easy to get the benefit of betterment arguments and standard of care arguments and things like that. So if there has to be a change in the design. So the way to mitigate those risks is to have a more complete design process to hopefully avoid changes in the design in the future. So that's really, how the design process is set up to mitigate a lot of the design related risks in design build. And it is really trying to, preserve at least some design process and get away from that incentive or perceived incentive to price a project too early. Now, that same design process mitigates a lot of the problems in the construction side too that we were raising earlier. Anytime there's changes to the design to achieve price or schedule targets, that's a problem. The more complete the design is before the contract sum is set, the less likely you're going to have some of the related construction delivery risks that are necessitated by design. It would theoretically be an adequate and appropriate design contingency within the contract sum, because it's a design build process. The expectation in the A141 is that even after the amendment is signed, the project will be further designed, to create essentially a construction set. So there's going to be more design and refinement, but hopefully the design that the contract sum is based on is developed enough that the design builder can establish an appropriate design contingency. So you're not going back to the owner saying, oh, there's all these changes in the design, we need more money, or something like that. And what really happens is the design builder is going to be going to the design team saying, where are we going to come up with this money? Same thing when you don't have changes to the construction work. You're not going to have those disputes. So again, the better the design can be, the better off you'll be during the construction process. We talked about back charging and withholding fee earlier, and so I want to try to preserve some time for questions at the end, so I won't go into this too much. The B143, which, if you remember the document diagram, is the design builder architect agreement. It does state that the design builder cannot withhold amounts from the architect's compensation to impose penalty or liquidated damages. So we wrote it, but if you'll remember earlier, the true limitations on the architect to protect, or the true limitations on this protection to the architect are more practical than they are legal. An architect could probably argue successfully under this agreement that the design builder can't withhold their amounts. That doesn't mean the design builder is not going to withhold amounts and try to back charge. But the reason it's in here is that back charging doesn't really work in a non-strict liability setting, and design professionals are not responsible on a strict liability basis. It's all based on the standard of care, which is why it's not covered. Back charging won't be covered by your insurance if it wasn't tied to a negligence claim. So that's why this provision is in here. And for similar reasons, you go to the next slide, the B143 also preserves the architect's standard of care. But as Jimmy pointed out, so this is a statement, I think it is identical to the B101 standard of care statement that Jimmy had on his slide on this topic. But as he noted, the limitations on its availability are more practical than they are legal. If you think about when do you determine if errors or omissions can have occurred, typically it's after the design is complete. But it's an ongoing design process and design build when these issues are coming up. So it's hard to imagine an actual error or omission determination having been made. Usually it's the design builder making that determination out of necessity and therefore depriving the benefit of the standard of care. But nevertheless, it's in the agreement, and the architect should get the benefit of it, and so should all of its design consultants. But as we noted, it's really more of a practical concern. So we have about, I think, 5 minutes left. I'm not sure, Jimmy, I can't actually see the questions, so if there are any. please feel free to share. We have, maybe we can put up some of the information slides while we talk about questions, but we do have some resources. If you want to visit our website, aiacontracts.org, we have a lot of resources on our Learn page. We also have a docinfo line and email, so please feel free to contact us there as well. And with that, Jimmy, if we have any questions, let's go ahead and tackle those.
Sure, we have a couple that came in. So it seems like this one might be appropriate for Donovan. In a progressive design build setup, what would be the risk to architects who work for a design build or a CM firm and stamp and seal drawings for them as part of the job? It seems like they've said that standard of care and E&O protections dissolve somewhat or even completely in a progressive design build setup.
Yeah, I think you know, your professional liability insurance is always going to cover you for negligence in the performance of professional services, and the risk that arises is when you take what would be ordinary negligence and you convert it either into a contractual liability, which is excluded by your professional liability policy, or you deal with it on a commercial basis, which doesn't allow a sort of a play out of the you know, was there a breach of the standard of care? Did you have a process for resolving that? Was there sufficient proof shown? And so two scenarios kind of pop up, liquidated damages being the first one. You know, you're taking damages delay, which would ordinarily be covered by professional liability insurance, and you're converting it into a contractual liability, and you know, that is potentially not or not completely covered. And so I think that's a huge risk. And another one would be in withholding and back charges, where you're really resolving errors and omissions on a commercial basis through fee withholding. It is almost impossible to go to your professional liability carrier after you got dinged on, you know, fee withheld on a contract and say, I'd like reimbursement because it was withheld because of errors and omissions. That conversation is almost dead on arrival. If you're working for the CM in their organization and you're not dealing with those commercial aspects, I think your professional liability is still going to cover you for errors and omissions in your, you know, in the performance of your work. It's a little bit different of scenario. It's when you're working as one of the other trades and you're being treated as one of the other trades, but your you know, coverage for those losses is not dealt with in the same way that the other trades are. That's kind of where the risk arises. And just on the material change question, I had a moment to think about that a little bit more, and I do think that there are changes that could occur, say in a mechanical system, maybe especially in building operations. You'll see these quite a bit, where the design builder is maybe using equipment or, you know, processes that are cheaper, faster to install. Maybe they meet the performance requirements, maybe they don't. But I think you're going to get into whether a material change occurred. It's really going to come down to whether or not the performance requirements were clear and whether or not the actual built work meets those requirements. And where they don't, I think the design builder is probably going to be, and the design team is going to have some risk.
Sure. Awesome. Well, we are bumping up against 4:30. So thank you, Donovan and Mike, for giving this presentation today. And thanks everyone for attending. We're going to send out a link to the recording as well as the slide deck. So you should be getting that, I think, within the next day or two. And if you don't get it, just let us know. Otherwise, thanks so much for stopping by and have a great rest of the day.